Well, good morning. We're glad you're with us today. We're going to talk about a book that you may or may not have ever thought about, talked about, looked at, known about, whatever. It's the book of Obadiah. Obadiah kind of gets overlooked in a lot of things. And so to do that, though, we want to start by asking you a question. This is kind of a strange question when you start thinking about the prophets, but how do you learn lessons in life? What do you mean the hard way? Over and over, okay? How do you learn lessons? Making mistakes. It's interesting. This is the age group where you talk about that, and they know that's the answer. If I went down further down the hallways to younger people, they would say something different, such as, well, you read this book or you go to this class. That's not what happens here. We say we learn lessons by experiences. How do experiences teach us things? You learn not to do it again? Does everybody do that?
No.
Why not, if that's what happens? We don't even do that. Sheila? Yeah, there are three ways to learn. One is by hearing, one is by seeing, one is by kinesthetics, which is touching things. So I don't know which one you are. You haven't noticed I'm a visual learner. I had a conversation in the hallway Wednesday night with one of the people who've been coming in this class, and he says, well, I like your slides. I said, let me tell you, I'm a visual learner. When I was preaching on Sundays at Noodle, Texas, we had no money. We had just gotten married. We had no money. But I invested money in a whiteboard, an easel, and markers, because if I can't have a picture, I don't do things very well. So how do experience teach us things? Why don't people always learn from experience? Pardon? Stubborn? I want you to think about the opening chapters of the book of Judges, for instance. The book of Judges has that recurring pattern about the people sin, they're delivered in the hands of their enemies, they cry out to God, God sends them a judge, and then through the book of Judges it starts all over again. We have to say those are the most dumb people we've ever met in our life. Never learn anything. But don't we do the same thing over and over again too? That's an interesting dilemma in all of this stuff. And so we learn from bad experience. I always like the story about the bank teller. It was his first day working, and the bank president suddenly was fired, and they made this new teller the president of the bank. And he is absolutely terrified, as you can imagine. So he goes to the president and he said, they made me what you're supposed to be, but I don't have a clue what I'm supposed to do. How do you make good decisions? And the bank president said, make bad decisions. And so that's kind of how that works out. It's that same way. The wise man will learn not only from his mistakes, but the mistakes of other people. The foolish person doesn't even learn from his own mistakes, much less the mistakes of other people. I always like it when Jesus, when he told stories, sometimes he used bad examples to teach good stories, good morals. For instance, there's that story about the rich fool that he tells about the man who thinks he can amass his fortune. He can do everything he wants, be everything he wants. He has many years to come, and yet all of a sudden his riches are taken from him. Jesus uses a bad example to teach a good lesson. The same is true about the unforgiving servant. The unforgiving servant of Matthew 18 is a man who he has forgiven this huge debt by the king, and he goes out and he demands that another servant, a fellow servant, pay up a few pennies, and he can't do it, and so he has him thrown in jail. And so the king calls him back in, throws him in jail. Now that's a bad example. You don't want to be like that servant. That's the thing about it. And so a lot of this is when you pay attention to things, you learn by example, and you learn by experience, and sometimes you learn by the experience of other people. And hopefully it catches. There's always that story about the kid who was acting up in class, and the teacher decided to go to his parents and say, look, your child's not behaving in class. And the mother said, that's okay. Said, just slap the kid next to him. Said, well, what good is that going to do? Said, well, he'll pay attention to what happens to that kid. Well, a lot of times we need to have somebody slap the kid next to us, I think. And that's kind of what Obadiah is all about. The little book of Obadiah, and it's a little book. You know, I say little book because it is the smallest book in the Old Testament. It has 21 verses. It's not large, it's not voluminous. It doesn't take but 5 minutes to get through. And so we're going to spend 45 minutes on a 5-minute book. That's what that means. But God's trying to teach a lesson that is more important than just the immediate setting. Let me give you a perspective on Scripture, at least from my point of view. That is, when a book is included in Scripture, the reason it's there is because it had an immediate lesson, but it also had a universal application. In other words, Scripture, what makes that list are things that apply in the 10th century BC, the 1st century AD, and the 21st century. You can find application in all of them. And I think that's true about Obadiah here as well, as we're going to see. Now, the question is, who in the world is Obadiah? That's a hard question to answer because there are 12 different people named Obadiah. If you have a common name, you have a problem. You get confused. When we lived on the Gulf Coast, I came home one day, and as during time you still had answering machines, on our answering machine was a very bitter voice threatening to send the sheriff out to arrest me because I had supposedly thrown trash on his property in a town I had never been to. Now, it bothered me for a while, and I thought, I think I know what happened. He started looking down the phone book for every Robert Taylor in the county. And so he probably sent this message to every Robert Taylor in the county. Well, that's kind of what Obadiah is. Who is Obadiah? I don't know. There's 12 of them. Which one? His name means servant. Now, that doesn't help us a lot. That's just what he was named. But there are some possibilities, I suppose. One is if you go to the story of Ahab. Now, Ahab and Jezebel, you remember that's where he's the king that Elijah has to face down the prophets of Baal with. He had a personal servant. He had a household servant, if you will. He's the kind of guy who takes care of everything for the household. And his name is Obadiah. And Obadiah, it says, feared the Lord greatly to the point that he hid 100 prophets in a cave away from Ahab. Some people think this is the same Obadiah of the book. We don't know that for sure because there's other ones. Roughly, this is probably 853, and the leader in Jehoshaphat's reign. There's an Obadiah there who is a teacher, and among many, and they teach the book of the law in Judah. This could be it too. We don't know anything about this. This is the only mention of him there. There's also an Obadiah that if you go 150 years later, you get down to Josiah's reign. And Josiah in Judah is the one who he's had terrible upbringing with a father and a grandfather who are about as bad as you get. He is raised by his mother. He takes the throne when he's 7, but his mother is basically pulling the strings behind him. But she teaches him well, apparently, because he decides that the temple is in shambles and it needs to be renovated. How dare we let the temple get in such bad shape? And so he goes into a renovation of the temple in Jerusalem, and one of the guys who's in charge of that is a guy by the name of Obadiah. That's like 622 AD or so. It's about like that. And so that could be the Obadiah that we're looking at. But here's a bunch of more. There's an Obadiah in the genealogy of David's descendants. Not one of the other ones either. There's an Obadiah who's a descendant of Issachar. There's one who is a descendant of Saul. There's one who's a temple musician. There's one who returns with the exiles from Babylon. Take your pick. We don't know who it is. The truth is, we know nothing about the man Obadiah. Now, we always I grew up in a time where everybody, if a person had a name hooked to a book, they had to be prominent. For instance, I was taught that Samuel wrote the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. The only problem with that, he dies halfway through 1st Samuel. And so he couldn't have written it, but we have to have a name there. We need to have some sort of supporting category there. That's not necessarily true. We don't know anything about Obadiah. We don't even know where he was from, because then we have to deal with what's going on in the world around him that prompts what he's going to say. Historical background is important. We're going to talk about this in every one. Because a prophet speaks to a particular problem at a particular time. He's telling you something about the time he lives in and a problem they're having. And you think about that sometimes, and it's really important because it tells you what's going on. There are clues that are usually found in the book about this. For instance, in Isaiah chapter 6 and verse 1, Isaiah says, "In the year that King Uzziah died, I was in the temple." Call of Isaiah takes place in 733. That's the year that King Uzziah died. We know that. It told us that. It's inside of the book. You look at the book and you say things like, are the Assyrians mentioned? That's one time frame. Are the Babylonians mentioned? That's another time frame. Are the Persians mentioned? That's a whole other one. Is Israel and Judah both mentioned, one of the other? Because if Israel is mentioned, it has to be before 722. That's when Israel was destroyed, sent into Assyrian captivity. And so if there is that nation, you have a certain timeline and not. But you see, just as much as we don't know anything about Obadiah, we don't know a lot about when he's writing or what time it comes from. It's murky. He talks about some things. For instance, he talks about his vision, the vision of Obadiah. It says, "Thus says the Lord concerning Edom." Now, we're going to get into all of this in a moment. "We've heard the report from the Lord, and a messenger spent through the nations. Rise up, let us rise up against her for battle." There's going to be a battle against Edom. Why? Because the violence done to your brother Jacob. And so there's those hints there that something has happened between Edom and Judah. That's the Jacob here, by the way. And so there's this problem that's going on there. And when did they have that problem? Well, that's another jump ball question. That's right. Exactly. And there's those things, we just don't know who those are, is the big problem. In fact, you look at this and you get a pretty broad time frame in a sense. It says, "In the days Edom revolted from the rule of Judah and set up a king of their own." And that was during the time of Jehoram. It says, "And they invaded and defeated Judah and carried away captives." See, that fits. The time of Jehoram, king of Judah, was around 850 BC. And that's around the era of Elisha, roughly. A little bit after that, perhaps. But at the same time, if you go to Lamentations, and Lamentations is written as the temple was burning and the people were being led off into Babylonian captivity, and it says, "Rejoice and be glad, O daughter of Edom, you who dwell in the land of Uz, but to you also this cup shall pass. You shall become drunk and strip yourself bare." Apparently what they've done is they have taken advantage of Judah's plight and they've plundered it. In other words, when Babylonians swept in, they took advantage. They were the raiders, if you will. This is the best illustration I have is when we lived on the Gulf Coast and a hurricane was threatening or coming through. There would be those people we call finger borrowers. What they do, they loot your house if you weren't there. Why do people stay in the middle of a hurricane? Because there are people who will loot your house. That's a real problem. And so these were the looters. They went in and claimed anything they wanted after Judah had been destroyed. Now, here's the problem. Either one of those are correct. And so, if this works, if not, Mike Powell has given me another one that I can use. It may be better right now. But if you look up here, I put red stars just to make sure you know where they are. That red star is by Jehoram, and you got the word Obadiah on that chart right there. But if you drop down to the other star, and you've got Jehoiakim and Zedekiah, which is around that time, you've got Obadiah right there. What that means, nobody has a clue which one that is. If you read through the Bible like I do with LaGard Smith's Daily Bible in chronological order, you may not do that. I've done it for years. Smith puts him early, but also admits not everybody sees it that way, and that's okay. Now, it takes a great man to say, I may be wrong. Most scholars say, I'm right, and you're all wet if you think anything different. At least he's smart enough to understand that. It can be in a place. I could have put this lesson 7 weeks from now, and it would have fit. I put it here because, if for nothing else, get it out of the way. It's early enough that I have a good case for it. I know that's not a good reason, but it's good enough for me, so that settles that issue for me at least. We don't know when this was written. We don't know what the true circumstances were. I'm going to base this on either one of them could be true, but it doesn't change the lesson it's trying to teach. The problem we have is we think that somehow it teaches one lesson. It teaches a broad lesson with multiple applications. This lesson, by the way, Obadiah applies to us. It also applied to Edom. We're not Edom, but it still applies, as you're going to see. Just to orient you to where we are in time and space. This is a map of the world at that time. You've got Judah up here, Jerusalem's way up here, and down here is the nation Edom. And Edom has an interesting history with God's people. This is a pot that has been simmering for centuries. You know any families that have estrangement in them? Where there are people who don't talk to each other? I do. I knew a family that one of the daughters was not invited to the mother's funeral because they didn't want her there. That's kind of an interesting problem, isn't it? But that's exactly what's going on in the background of Obadiah. You've got two nations, Judah and Edom. We know where they come from. When Rebekah is pregnant, she is pregnant with twin boys. They have not been named yet. But God comes to her and says to her, 2 nations are in your womb. 2 people from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. It's flipped. That's not what's supposed to happen. And then you get a little farther into the story, and you remember what happened. Jacob liked to cook, and so he's cooking this bowl of stew, or this bowl of pottage, bean soup, if you will. And Esau has gone off into the hunt. Esau is this hairy red man. You can almost imagine what he looks like. He could look like a red-headed wrestler, if you will. Picture WWE with red hair. Big stretch, but it's okay. He comes in, he's hungry, he's tired. He says, give me a bowl of that soup. And Jacob says, what's it worth to you? Is it worth your birthright? And he says, what good is my birthright if I'm going to die of hunger anyhow? Yeah, isn't that an interesting experience? And he says, okay, here's the soup. I'll take the birthright. Fine. Years pass. They come down to the point that Isaac's about to die. And Isaac begins handing out the blessing. And you know the story that Jacob comes in. He kind of hoodwinks his blind father by putting on goat skins and preparing venison. And so it betrays that something's wrong, but he doesn't know what it is. But he blesses Jacob. But then when Esau comes in, Esau wants a blessing as well. His blessing is this: behold, away from the fatness of the earth shall your dwelling be. By the way, that map, that's about as far away from anything that grows as there is. Away from the dew of heaven on high. You won't have any money, you won't have any prosperity, you won't have any power, you won't have anything. That's what he tells Esau. And because he is red, the Hebrew term for red is Edom. And so these are the descendants of Esau. And so you have this battle that's going on constantly from the very time of birth. And it says that when you get to Numbers chapter 20, Moses is leading the people to the promised land. And what they want to do is just pass through the land. And if they need to water their herds, they'll pay for the water. Doesn't seem like an unreasonable request, does it? Here's how Edom saw it. You won't pass through lest I come out with a sword against you. That's the old man saying, get off my lawn. But it's on a global scale. He said, just let us pass through on foot. We won't bother anything. We'll pay you for the water we use. And it says that Edom came out against them with a large army and a strong force. And thus Edom refused to give Israel passage through the territory. So Israel turned away from him. You don't think that sticks in your craw. Keep telling that story over and over again. It's getting really bad. And so you come to the book of Obadiah, and it deals with a single problem. You and I have it too. It says, the pride of your heart has deceived you. Have you ever been deceived? How would you define pride if you had to define it? I always like what Paul says in Romans 12. He says, don't think of yourself too highly than you ought. Pride is thinking of yourself too highly than you should be. I can do anything. I'm impervious to life. I can do whatever I think. It's the guy that brags, I can do whatever, I can match whatever you do plus some. And so it says, the pride of your heart has deceived you. You have told yourself how important and how good you are. And you who live in the clefts of the rock, that's all they got up there. In your lofty dwellings, you say, who can bring me down to the ground? We are totally protected. We are totally innocent. We can take care of anything we want because nobody's going to be able to bother us. And so that's how they're operating out of their life. Do we ever do that? Do we think we're bigger than our britches? A teenager goes faster than he ought to drive. Why? I'm a good driver. I'm a better driver than everybody else. Dad says, slow down. He says, what do you know, old man? And old man knows a lot more than he thinks. He says, but you're going to be made small. See, pride says you make yourself big. You know, it's the gorilla pounding his chest. I'm big. He says, okay, if you think you're so big, I'll make you small. Behold, I'm going to make you small among the nations. You won't have a standing. You'll be utterly despised. Nobody will care about you. So whatever you think you are, you're not. And then he says, understand something. He said, when thieves come in, they don't take everything, just what they need. When someone comes to the great vineyard, he said, they don't glean everything. They leave something. And but it says that's not what's going to happen to you. He said, all of your allies have driven you to your border, and those at peace with you have deceived you. What they've said was, we'll take care of you. We've got your back. That's kind of what that says. And it says, they have prevailed against you. They do the attacking, and they eat your bread, and have set a trap for you. He said, let me tell you something, Edom. You think you're so important. The people you think you can trust are going to take advantage of you too, like you've taken advantage of other people. And you hear this. Now, this is the part that if I wanted to use this as part of a lesson that came out of the destruction of Jerusalem, I think this is where it would fit. It says, you stood aloof on the day strangers carried off his wealth and foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem. You were like one of them. When things were hurting God's people, you did two things. You stood aloof and didn't help, and you took advantage of the situation for your own good. A lot of people do that. They wait, and then they can take advantage of whatever the situation is. He says, do not stand at the crossroads to cut off his fugitives. Do not hand over the survivors in the day of distress. He said, one of the things you did, there were people fleeing for their lives, and you rounded them all up and gave them back to the enemy. It's a terrible thing. Not only did you do nothing, you did things that were treacherous at the same time. You who think you're so important. And then he talks about a phrase that we will come back and forth to. We're going to come back to it next week again. But the term, the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord is a concept in the Old Testament that can be applied in different ways, but basically means there's a time of God's great power in which he is going to eradicate the chaos and put his order back into things. It says, for the day of the Lord is near to the nations. As you have done, it will be done to you, and the deeds will be upon your own head. The day is coming. It's not very far away now. When Scripture says it's not very far away, don't try to get your calendars out. We don't know. People want to call the day of the Lord and say, I know when the day of the Lord is. No, you don't. All I can say, it's near. He says, but as you have done, it shall be done unto you. Return, and it will return on your own head. I like what this says, essentially what Jesus says. When he says, so whatever you wish others do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. The golden rule, isn't it? That if people need your help, give them your help, because on the day that you need help, God will give you yours. But if you ignore it, you'll get the same thing. But he says there is going to be a reversal of fortunes. You maybe have been big, but you're going to be made small. And Judah and Jerusalem and Mount Zion, they're going to be lifted back up. And there will not be a survivor of the house of Esau. For thus the Lord has spoken. Edom eventually sank into the sands of time in history. Edom would be conquered, as would the rest of the world, by Alexander the Great. And Alexander would do all kinds of things in his short tenure. The Syrians would come, the Egyptians would come, they would blend with people. Edom would become what the Samaritans were to the Jews. They would become a nation called the Edomians. The Edomians were a half-bred, cross-bred culture that really didn't have much of anything, except for one thing. They did have a successor in that line who made something of himself. His name was Herod the Great. He was an Edomian. And so that's kind of shows you what happens to that. Now, the question I've got is only for Edom. We're always tempted to read books like this and say, well, that applies to Edom. They're not here today. And so that doesn't really make any difference to us, does it? And yet, the question still lingers, is it only for Edom? Is not Judah and Israel to learn a lesson from this as well? See, the day comes where Judah and Israel both will say, we are God's chosen people. We are special. Prophets will always say that, as we're going to come to some of these books, especially in Hosea and Amos, that because of our sacrifices, because of our faithful temple attendance, God has blessed us. And so we have done so well that God is glad He knows us. It's the Pharisee in the temple who says, Lord, I'm grateful that I'm not like all these other people, especially the tax collectors. Yes, same idea. And so this is slapping the kid next to you, if you will. He wants Judah and Israel to understand the same things. You are not so big either that this can't happen to you. Now, because I put this early, it will happen to them in rapid fire form. But this is also a book that tells us that God is concerned about all the nations, not just His chosen people. There's an idea about what does it mean to be God's chosen people. I find it interesting every once in a while. Things cross-link, and this morning's reading and my daily Bible reading was Romans 9 through 11, and it has to do with the Jews and the gospel. And the point Paul makes is, He made you chosen for a reason. It wasn't because you were so special. It was so that the Gentiles would have a chance. Now that's the short version of that. But God has always been concerned about the nation. He wanted, listen to this, He wanted His people to act in such a way that people would see God living in them and want to serve Him too. Remember what Rahab the harlot said. The men come to her and she says, we have seen your God at work. Save me. Ends up in the bloodline of Jesus, by the way. God is concerned about all people. That's what happens when you get to Acts chapter 10. Acts chapter 10, you have this metaphor of the food. And God tells Peter to rise, eat, and He puts all this stuff in a sheet and lets it down and says, eat all this stuff. I mean, there's stuff like eels and squid and spiders and, I don't eat that stuff. I mean, I have a hard time with certain things. I've had to eat cow's tongue. I have a policy about eating what's been in the cow's mouth, frankly. I ate it, but it wasn't pleasant. But I don't think I could ever eat crickets. They say they're wonderful, but I don't think I want to be the one to do it. But see, that's what Peter's facing. He said, rise, kill, and eat. And he said, I can't because these are unclean things, and I've never touched unclean things. And he goes through this little rigmarole 3 times, and he finally dawns on him when the knock comes on the door. We're not talking about food, we're talking about people. So he goes to Cornelius and he says, truly I understand that God shows no partiality. But in every nation, anyone who fears Him and does what is right is acceptable to Him. It doesn't say that God now shows no partiality. God shows no partiality. And so Edom was given a warning for them to change, hopefully to be saved. They didn't. But that's what the hope was. By the way, when we get to Jonah, you're going to hear the same speech again. But this is kind of what the whole theme of the book of Obadiah is. Proverbs chapter 16, verse 18 says, pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. What Paul says is a variant of that. He says, beware lest you think you stand, because therein you fall. There's always something in us that when you think you're more important than you are, or you're better than you are, or you're impervious to things. I have known men who said, I I'm impervious to the temptation of lust. Tell me another one. That's when you say, that never happened to me. Oh, those are hard words to taste coming back in your mouth. Everything is a problem. If you know that if you have difficulties, that's okay. But don't say I can't when you will. And that's kind of what Obadiah is about. But there's something else I think in here that's important to us. How we see others, especially in their calamity, determines how God will see us. You ever think about that? We will be treated in the same way we treat other people. If you want grace, you better extend it. If you want judgment, you can give that. Beware what comes out of your mouth and your heart, because that's going to be a big problem for you. And so, what do you see? What does God see in you? Because that's what you're going to experience. Next week, we're going to go to Joel. Joel is what I call the prophet of Pentecost. He is best remembered for the words spoken by Peter in Acts chapter 2. So next week, we'll explore Joel and his prophecy.